One of the most dominant crops grown at the Mount Vernon estate during its early stages was tobacco. However, growing tobacco was extremely labor-intensive and terrible for the soil, as it depleted its nutrients by absorbing much more nitrogen than other crops would. Once harvested, much of the tobacco was then shipped to the mother country, England. The problem for Washington and many other Virginian farmers was they never knew how much their products would net them, as they were at the mercy of a London broker who would determine the worth, often giving them far less than its actual value. By 1765, Washington began to distance himself from tobacco growth altogether, switching over to wheat. This proved to be very lucrative for Washington for multiple reasons. First, as previously stated, maintaining and growing tobacco was very difficult, requiring massive amounts of slave labor, so transitioning to wheat left Washington with a surplus of slave labor readily available for other jobs. Secondly, Washington did not have to export his products across the Atlantic for sale and wait for a broker to determine the tobacco's worth. Finally, the wheat could easily be harvested and shipped just a few miles up the road to nearby Alexandria for immediate sale and payment. In the coming years, Mount Vernon would become a self-sustained farm that seemingly grew and produced everything from wheat to bricks. One visitor said, "When I reached the place, I thought I was entering a rather large village, but later was told that all of it belonged to him." With an immense number of additional laborers available for Washington, growth and expansion was imminent. Soon, there would be indentured servants from distant countries such as Ireland who labored for years teaching the slaves at Mount Vernon different trades. It was said that there were carpenters, bricklayers, bakers, blacksmiths, and other well-trained slave artisans at Mount Vernon. One such slave, Tom Davis, was trained in many areas and became sort of a maintenance man, making everything from bricks to hanging the latest bright green wallpaper. Washington also capitalized on another resource, one which he did not have to grow, that practically resided in his backyard: fish. When most people think of George Washington, they don't think about fishing. But Washington loved fish, and as documented, he ate fish heartily and regularly. Washington actually once bragged to a British friend that the Potomac was one of the best stocked rivers in the world for fishing. Another visitor said, "I've seen for several hours together in a summer's evening hundreds, perhaps thousands of sturgeon." The fishery on the Potomac also proved to be very rewarding for Washington, and was so good that Washington actually began to salt and pack fish in barrels for sale. The Potomac was filled with a vast array of fish, including shad, herring, carp, sturgeon, bass, and many other species of fish, which became a staple part of the slaves' diet at Mount Vernon. With close to 200 slaves at its apex, needless to say, there were lots of children around the estate. Washington often grumbled that some of the small slave children who played in the front yard were destroying his shrubs. Not having been previously married or having any children of his own, when George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, he also became the stepfather of 2 children from Martha's previous marriage, Jackie and Patsy Custis. Although he was their stepfather, Washington never seemed to feel fatherly to them, as he always felt the need to balance a fine line, especially regarding discipline. Perhaps this was due to the fact that they were Martha's only surviving family. Death was all too familiar to Martha, having lost both parents, her first husband Daniel Parke Custis, several siblings, and 3 children. In fact, Martha became so overly protective of the children that she scarcely let them out of her sight, in fear that something bad may happen to them. She often feared that a barking dog or someone approaching the house was going to inform her of a tragedy. On one occasion, George and Martha traveled out of town without Jackie and Patsy for a short time, and Martha was so weary and anxious about the children that she never traveled without them again. To make matters worse, young, beautiful Patsy developed some type of epilepsy where she would be overtaken with violent seizures. These seizures continued to worsen as Patsy grew, and Martha would scarcely take her eyes off young Patsy. The Washingtons summoned many different doctors, trying everything that was available at the time, ranging from different powders, bloodletting, which often weakened her further, to rings that were said to alleviate the disease, but nothing seemed to work. George loved Patsy dearly and treated her like a young princess, buying her beautiful necklaces and clothes. Like many parents who have had sick children, the Washingtons grew desperate and were willing to try almost anything. After several years of seizures, the illness grew worse, to the point where Washington began logging it in his diary. Washington recorded that from June 29th to September 22nd, 1770, Patsy had no fewer than 26 seizures that sent her to the floor. Even the famous painter that Jackie Custis brought home from college, Charles Wilson Peale, said about Patsy, "We used to walk together to enjoy the evening breeze, and dance to give exercise to Miss Custis, who did not enjoy good health. She was subject to fits, and Mrs. Washington never suffered her to be a minute out of her sight." Then on Saturday, June 19th, 1773, at the tender age of 17, Patsy Custis died suddenly at the dinner table from a massive seizure. George was beside himself, weeping. He stated in his diary, "Home all day. About 5 o'clock, poor Patsy Custis died suddenly." Washington was, as I stated, extremely taken back, as he truly loved young Patsy as his own. In a touching letter to his brother-in-law, Washington said, "It is an easier matter to conceive than to describe the distress of this family, especially that unhappy parent of our dear Patsy Custis. When I inform you that yesterday removed the dear, sweet, innocent girl into a more happy and peaceful abode than any she has met in the afflicted path she hitherto has trod. She rose from dinner about 4 o'clock, in better health and spirits than she had appeared to have been in for some time. Soon after, she was seized with one of her usual fits, and expired in less than 2 minutes, without uttering a word, a groan, or a scarce sigh. This sudden and unexpected blow, I scarce need add, has almost reduced my poor wife to the lowest ebb of misery, which is increased by the absence of her son." One observer recalled Washington kneeling by her bed as tears rolled down his face as he wept bitterly. With a broken voice, Washington uttered the prayers for the dead. Martha would wear a black mourning cape for the next year, as she grieved yet another death, leaving her only soon-to-be married son, Jackie. Kindly enough, Jackie's fiancé stepped in and played the role of another daughter-like person in Martha's life. Death visited the young far too often in the 18th century. On George's side of the family, the males almost all passed away before they reached their mid-40s, so the question of mortality must have swirled around in Washington's head many times as he entered the 4th decade of his life. Patsy Custis was quickly buried and laid to rest the following day in the Washington tomb with a full religious ceremony. Many religious and non-religious people have made much about the Founding Fathers and their beliefs in God, Jesus, and the afterlife. During the 18th century, an idea known as the Enlightenment was introduced and popularized, challenging many aspects of the Christian faith, specifically the miraculous, and relegating biblical miracles to folklore or later traditions introduced into the text. Some of the Founding Fathers were explicitly deists, namely Thomas Jefferson, Ethan Allen, Thomas Paine, and Ben Franklin. However, we know quite a bit about Washington's religious beliefs, and while there is some opaqueness in certain areas, it seems quite convincing that Washington was indeed a Christian. If one defines deism properly, that God does not intervene in human affairs, then it becomes extremely difficult to insert Washington into this belief system. Washington believed very much so that God directly intervened in his personal affairs on a number of occasions, specifically when he had 4 bullets pass through his coat, 1 through his hat, and several horses shot out from under him. Washington grew up in a home with a devout Christian mother, Mary Ball Washington, and according to Washington's adopted grandson, she was in the habit of repairing every day to a secluded spot, formed by rocks and trees near to her dwelling, where, abstracted from the world and worldly things, she communed with her Creator in humiliation and prayer. So there is no doubt that George's mother raised him in the Christian faith. But did this faith carry over into adulthood? George Washington was a creature of habit, and based on his journal and eyewitness accounts, he would awake before sunrise in his robe, get updated on relevant news and information, pray with his Bible open for an hour, eat breakfast, and start the day. Washington was also a committed church attendee, depending on where he was living. While at Mount Vernon, he attended Pohick Episcopal Church and was very active there. In fact, his priest said, "I never knew so constant an attendant at church as Washington." Some people argue that because Washington never participated in communion or kneeled during the reciting of prayer, that this signaled unbelief. But Washington, as stated by his adopted granddaughter, said he was not one of those to act or pray that they might be seen of men. In fact, many people spoke about Washington's simple, childlike faith, and that he never got involved in religious debate or quarrels. It should also be understood that while Washington rarely, if ever, invoked the name of Jesus in his letters, he was a product of his time, and used much of the common language used for God during that time, such as Creator, Providence, Author of our being, Heaven, and Destiny. George and Martha were also exceedingly charitable. Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear, stated that there were hundreds of records of individuals, charities, and churches that Washington donated to that were never known to the public during Washington's lifetime. Regarding the Golden Rule, Washington informed one of his housekeepers that the door to Mount Vernon was always open to anyone and everyone. The Washingtons never turned away guests, even beggars. Washington said, "Let the hospitality of this house with respect to the poor be kept up." Even after Washington was selected to serve at the Continental Congress, he said, "Let no one go away hungry, provided it does not encourage them in idleness." After the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, Britain had accumulated a tremendous amount of debt and desperately needed to pay it back. Instead of absorbing the debt themselves, it was then transferred to the American colonists in the form of what came to be known as the Stamp Act. This new tax put into law by Parliament taxed certain goods such as magazines, newspapers, and playing cards, among other things. This caused the colonists to go into an uproar because the very people that fought by the mother country's side were having to pay back the cost incurred from the war. It is also noteworthy that when the British enacted the Stamp Act, to add insult to injury, they attempted to devalue the colonial currency by allowing trade to only occur with the British pound, thus making the colonial money worthless. By 1767, not seeming to learn from their previous mistake, the British abolished the Stamp Act and introduced the Townsend's Act, which placed duties on paint, glass, paper, and tea, further aggravating the Americans, leading to the famous statement, "No taxation without representation." For Washington and the other colonists, these taxes were direct infringements upon their liberties and freedom because Parliament never consulted them about the taxes. Rather, they were imposed on them without their consent. At this point in time, Washington and the others sought to protest these taxes. However, when protesting failed, a boycott ensued of British products and was put in place. A very important point to underscore is that it was never the intent of the Americans to outright rebel against the king and the mother country, and taking up arms was always the last resort. Even after British soldiers were sent to enforce these new taxes put into law, Ben Franklin said, "They will not find a rebellion, but they may indeed make one," signaling that while the Americans were extremely upset, they would not rebel unless first provoked. As tensions with the mother country grew, it was becoming increasingly evident that war was inevitable. Before the Second Continental Congress, General Thomas Gage received orders to arrest two rabble-rousers, Sam Adams and John Hancock. Gage and the British also had plans of seizing a powder magazine in Concord. However, some of the Patriots were given information about the ensuing raid. This is when Paul Revere sprang into action, riding his horse to alert the Patriots of the impending attack on their only means of defense. The war began with the historic shot heard around the world in Lexington. No one actually knows for sure who shot first, but this shot started the point of no return. During the battle, the Redcoats were retreating back to Boston, but they were surrounded by farmers, kids, and craftsmen, also known as the Minutemen, who under the cover of trees and fences caused significant losses to the British force, killing some 273. John Adams said, "The Battle of Lexington on the 19th of April changed the instruments of warfare from the pen to the sword." Soon thereafter, General George Washington was made Commander-in-Chief. Rising in his place, he briefly expressed his high and grateful sense of honor conferred on him, and his sincere devotion to the cause. But, he added, lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorable to my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room, that I this day declare, with the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with.